Hello, and welcome to The Prodigal Life. I'm Deacon Harold, and I'm joined, as usual, by Nick and Ellen. And we are here to help you make a deeper, more richer connection to your faith and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Today, we have a guest with us from an organization whose namesake is arguably one of the coolest dudes that there's been in the last several, I don't know, what, can we say decades anymore, even though we're into the first century? 21st century. Anyway, of recent history, of archaeological history, one of the coolest dudes that there's been around. Ellen, who are we talking to today?
We are talking to Dr. Peter Howard, who is the founder of the Venerable Fulton Sheen Institute. And he's very passionate about Fulton Sheen and everything Fulton Sheen. I would definitely say he's a theologian, and he is definitely has a lot of information and knowledge for us. But first, he's going to share kind of his testimony with us. I don't know what part of his testimony we're going to get. We'll see how that goes.
And before we dive into that, I think for listeners or viewers who aren't familiar with who Fulton Sheen was and is, he was such a forward-thinking bishop. He saw media happening and he was like, we need to own that. Like, we need to be in there and be in front of it. And that to me is something that we need to reclaim as a church. And I get so excited when I see how he did things. It's a big part of why I started Awaken Catholic, is that's trying to achieve a similar end. So Fulton Sheen, if you've never heard of him, you're about to get a nice tasting of it, and it's definitely worth your watch or listen. Dr. Peter, tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks, Nick, first for having me on your podcast here. It's an honor. It's an honor, and I've been always inspired by seeing the work of others. Oh goodness, everybody kind of has their BC moments. I've had so many reversions, but maybe I'll summarize early life in this: cradle Catholic. My wife is from Puerto Rico. My mother's from Puerto Rico. My father was Irish, and that's kind of the household I grew up in. Nothing super spectacular as far as the life of the faith, but God has a way of interjecting things. As Fulton Sheen would say, the only way God finds a way into some hearts is to break them. And mine wasn't maybe so much a heartbreak, but it was a tragedy. And I was in high school just a few days before Christmas, and all of a sudden, police officers came to my home, and it was our last day of school. We just got back before the break, and we knew something bad had happened. And so the police officers wouldn't even talk to the kids. They said, "Where's your mother?" So eventually, she came to the door, and we just kind of watched like a movie. It's just silence. The police are behind the door that's open, and so I just see my mom and her head just kind of nodding and nodding. And we knew it was really bad. And then she looked to us kids in the family room. I'll never forget this. She just said, "Start praying the rosary." Now, we never prayed the rosary. It was we knew of it. Maybe I prayed one or two in my whole life. But my mom said, "Start praying." And she took off. The police officers took her to the hospital. Anyway, this began a big conversion moment, in that I have to attribute it to, I do attribute it to our Blessed Mother. And we began to experience miracles. We prayed. My father was found dead. It was a really bad accident. He was hit by a drunk driver. The only day that he happened to be in Princeton, because I'm from New Jersey originally, and going Christmas shopping. So he should never have been where he was, middle of the day. And just this guy was drunk and on drugs, and he hit him at a stoplight. So the guy was going like 70 miles an hour and hit my dad, who was stopped and behind a propane truck. And he had his little 2-door Datsun. So you could just begin to imagine what the crumple was. He somehow steered it away, went into a field. People, they have no idea how he made it. But anyway, he was found dead at the scene, and somebody was able to revive him because just across the street was an ambulance. This was all significant because when you look back at things, you begin to see God's providential hand behind every aspect of this. You should never have survived the accident to begin with, but They resuscitated him, brought him to the hospital. They couldn't handle him in Princeton, so they shipped him off to up north. Anyway, that night, doctor said, say goodbye to your dad, and they don't expect him to make it through the night. My mother was in the chapel, and I remember looking at her and just saying, Mom, I'm only 14. And she just said, just keep praying, keep praying, keep praying. And so we did. And lo and behold, my father made it through the next night, and after that. And then the doctor said, we don't know how he's alive. And then they said, but we need to share some news. His spinal cord was severed, and he'll never move from the neck down. And at that point, we were just happy he was alive. But he, anyway, we prayed, and we began to experience miracle after miracle, because weeks later, he started moving his hands, and then he started moving his arms a little bit. And the doctors are saying it's impossible from the whatever sea level it was that was severed. And so anyway, that radically changed my family's life. And, in those moments, you can go either way. You could either hate God, like how could you allow this to happen? What did we do wrong? Or what, usually get really selfish. What did I do wrong to deserve this? But it was my mother. She really was the Marian figure in this. And every day we visited my dad. We prayed the rosary from that day onward. And so that really was the spark of my faith. And then a couple of years later, my mom took all of us kids on a pilgrimage to this obscure place in Yugoslavia at the time that I had just heard about. She's like, oh, let's go check it out. A lot of people are going there. Our Lady is apparently appearing there. There's miracles. People's rosaries turning gold. And I'm just like, okay. I was intrigued by all that kind of stuff. Of course, I wanted to pray for my dad. I was like, well, maybe there'd be a miracle. Anyway, that experience that I had in Medjugorje really was the launching point, though, of a great love for Our Lady, and being brought into, there's another drama going on beside my own drama of my family. And it just sparked a lot of things within me of, Lord, what have you created me for? And at that time of life, my passion was to be like a fighter pilot, Top Gun, go to the U.S. Naval Academy. And, I got nominated to go by my congressman, but then I had health issues that really jeopardized my whole health record. So that wasn't to happen. So asthma never helps. Anyway, but God, I kind of felt, looking back now, I felt it was kind of like a Maximilian Kolbe moment. He's one of my favorite saints, because it was like, Lord, what do you want to do? I have such a passion. I love my country. I want to give my life for something. I want to fight. I want to, fight for something bigger than myself. And it was just, this infusion of light of, well, there is something. There is a much bigger battle, and I'm gonna form you to fight it. And so that took me on a huge journey. Graduated high school, wasn't sure what I was going to do. Went to a party school, which equates to a Jesuit university. And one of the biggest ones out in that area, University of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And my siblings had gone there, and I was like, it was like a testing year. Like, what am I going to do? So I was going to do physical therapy. It was top school at the time. And anyway, went there. Really had just got into everything bad right away, because it was a party school, and things were not going well. One night, this was like about around this time of year. All my friends, everybody was out. I was like in the party dorm, Martin Hall. And I still remember that. And everybody was out, and I happened to stay back. And I commandeered my roommate's stereo, like I always did. My roommates always had more than me, so I just took it over. And I just felt moved. I said, you know what? I want to put on something peaceful. So I happened to have a cassette tape of Gregorian chant. And I put it on. I was looking out into the quad, and I had this moment where the only way I can really describe it was, I didn't see all of my sins, but I was given a light to know the state of my soul before God at that moment. And it wasn't pleasant, because it was, well, Peter, much, enough, and that you were doing so many good things and holy things before this moment, and you're throwing it all away, and this doesn't lead to heaven, it leads to hell. And the other part was like, I knew I had to make a decision right then and there. Am I going to continue it? And so I broke down in tears, just looking out my window, and I just knew how hard it was going to be, because, all my friends were there, and I'm surrounded. I mean, the stuff that I was surrounded with all day long. I mean, they were nice guys. I mean, I guess we say they were good guys. We got along. But as far as the moral levels, it was awful. The language was terrible. My language was terrible. This is University of Scranton. So like a lot of these guys are coming from Long Island. And, it's like certain words are used as noun, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs in the same sentence. And, and my language was kind of in that way. Although I always had an aversion to the Lord's name in vain. But anyway, I made a choice. I was in a relationship at the time. She was a really nice girl, really solid, and I wasn't leading that down the right path. And it was like, okay, how do I do this? And so the first thing was, I have to get to confession. And I started going to confession every week. And I have to say, this was a miracle, because my language was really bad. It was kind of like what I was describing. And within 2 to 3 weeks, my language, my foul language had completely ceased. Like, I didn't have an inclination, and it was gone. Now here I am trying to, be a good example to my friends, and hey, could we not use that kind of language? Like, what you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. I had like no credibility, and because they just knew I was the same way. But over time, they began to see it was real. I broke up in the relationship that I was in. That was hard, because I knew I hurt somebody in more than one way. And it was just like detaching myself. And then I made a decision to transfer. And I said, I got to get out of here. And I think maybe God's calling me. I don't know. I loved my faith so much. I said, maybe God's calling me to be a priest. Of course, everybody I knew, my mom's friends, they all thought, for sure, Peter, you are absolutely called. I felt a lot of pressure. But I did have a great love, and my mind was sort of like, well, if I love the Lord and I'm a kind of a maximalist, like I'm going to go all out. For me, that equated priesthood. And it wasn't until many, many years later, but I began to realize that while it is a sublime vocation, the ultimate vocation is holiness. And our Blessed Mother wasn't even a priest, and yet she's the queen of priests, and she's the mediatrix of all graces. Of course, I learned these terms later on, but it was like, and so anyway, I transferred. I went to Franciscan University in Steubenville. This is the early 90s. And that was a whole nother path of just being immersed in my faith. Where am I getting, where are you leading me, Lord? But I knew I was in a good spot. Left there, I went overseas for about 8 months. I was looking into religious life with a community in Rome, and it was just starting. And we were invited by the Cardinal Vicar of Rome at the time, Cardinal Ruini. It was really extraordinary. And it was a really intense boot camp, though, for me. I mean, we lived a very strict life of poverty and divine providence. I'm the youngest of 4, and so I was spoiled pretty much. And I realized this when I was there, where like I never thought I would be on a daily basis cutting off corners, whole sections of bread that had mold, so we could eat the other part that was hard, and it would be a part of our dinner. We never had anything fresh unless we were serving mass near. If you've been to Rome, it's the church was Santa Maria degli Angeli e dei Martiri, right near the train station Termini. They have the old baths, a lot of martyrs already, of the angels and of the martyrs. And it was just, we served mass there sometimes. And then it was like, when we got a real meal, it was like, everything changed for me as far as being grateful. I just realized how ungrateful I was and how spoiled I was on so many different things. And the Lord stripped me in that experience. And eventually was discerned that wasn't where I was meant to be, came back. But I took all this with me. And anyway, taught for a little bit, for a year down in Dallas in a great community of young adults. And I was like, I still have this priesthood thing going. It's open. I need to deal with this. I need to have some closure. So I ended up going to Denver, spent a year with another new community. This was back when Archbishop Chaput had just opened up the seminary, and it was a lot of great things going on. And I spent a year there, and right at this time, I got introduced to Venerable Fulton Sheen, and that's when my whole life went to a whole different level, because I had heard about this man, and that was about it. He's everybody likes to quote him, but nobody ever really treated him like I know him now. I think he's one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Like you could say, arguably, but it would be a very difficult argument to win against Sheen. His intellect was amazing. But right before I went to Denver, I took a personal retreat in Texas, and my sister said, "Hey, here's a stack of cassette tapes, and why don't you give it a shot?" This retreat was given in 1972, and our pastor was there at this retreat, and our pastor just died, a few months before. He's very young. He died of cancer, and he was there, and this retreat defined his priesthood until the day he died. And I said, well, all right, well, it's worth giving it a shot. I got 3.5 hours from Dallas to East Texas, and the Longview area. And I put it in, and it was a remastered cassette series. So it wasn't like this, he's talking, you can kind of hear the time period behind it. It's like I'm talking to you right now. And I put it in, and within about 3 minutes, I was completely hooked on this man. I felt like he was right next to me, that he was giving me now a personal retreat. And like Fulton Sheen, I had to make a choice of my life based on that. And I was like, oh, but I sat in my car most of this retreat. It was a beautiful cabin that I was at, but I don't know if there was anything in there to play it. So I just sat in my car and listened to these 30-minute talks. And by now I have most of them almost memorized. I listened to it so many times, but I realized, I felt like those who listen to Jesus, who would say, who's this man who speaks to us with such authority? I had, Franciscan University, I had some of the best teachers in the world. But nobody reached me in mind and in spirit like this man. And I knew my life wasn't going to be the same. And so anyway, long story short, that led me to then look into this community in Denver. I'm like, I just need to know about this, if this is what the Lord wants. And it ended up not being, but it was another step in the path of where he was leading me. And then at the end of this period, I met my wife. And we met among hundreds of thousands of people in St. Louis when the Pope was there, Pope John Paul II. And at that time, I was actually with this community, so we didn't formally meet. She happened to be standing around me and some other brothers that I was with in this community, and they were debating Seventh-day Adventists, and she had this big trash bag, with her. And what she was doing is she was walking around and she was collecting all the anti-Catholic tracts. People say, hey, here's the death cookie, here's the this, here's the that. And she said, oh, thank you. And then she's put in the trash bag and then hand out like pillar of fire, pillar of truth or something like that. And I just, but nice. But that was how I remembered her, because she had this huge trash bag and she just kind of sat there listening to this really intense debate. And I was just standing there in the, cassock, cape, beret. It's just like, looked like something out of a Scarlet and the Black. And anyway, after the community, it just basically fizzled out, and I ended up staying in Denver. I went on a retreat, and our paths had crossed again, and I remembered her, and then she remembered me, and then God kind of took it from there. And we got married in 2002. And in the midst of that, though, I had spent some time in a few years in Rome on my own. And I figured, well, this is it. I'm going to go and get my advanced degrees. I'll figure it out. I know this is what God wants of me. And it's, sort of, he leadeth me. And so I did. I went over there. And then near the end of that, we got married in 2002. And ended up serving the church after that for many, many years in different capacities, in almost every capacity, from being like a bishop's theologian, speechwriter, head of communications, like all these things at the same time in my early 20s, mid 20s. It was pretty awesome. And then
that's wild to be given so much responsibility at such a young age.
Yeah, well, it was providence. The bishop at the time, God rest his soul, he just passed away, I think, a year ago, Bishop Michael Sheridan. It was quite an experience that I had there, and he inherited a very, I don't like using these terms, but you know what I mean, because they're all political terms, but it was a very liberal diocese. Having been brought to this diocese, it needed a lot of work, and I was just so excited because first I didn't realize he was actually going to consider me. Once I got my license degree from Rome at the Angelicum, I just contacted everyone, in the country, seminaries, you name it. All my friends got like immediately brought into seminaries because they knew somebody. They're all teachers, and I'm like, I don't know what God wants. And anyway, I wrote to him, and it looked like a canned letter back, thanks for looking into, I wish you all the best, but if you're ever in town, stop by and we'll talk. I just felt like I needed to write him back, and I did. And I said, look, well, here's a plan that I have. Here's thoughts that I have that I think I could help you with. And then I got a phone call within about 2 days, and it was, Peter, I'm actually real serious. Why don't you come out here and we'll talk? So I did. I drove out there, and kind of the rest was history. He brought me on board, and it was, I worked with a lot of good people, but it was a lot of challenges as well. There was eventually, it was time to move on. It's been a long time, but this was like in the early days of, I don't even know what it is, like almost pre-social media. But there was a big controversy that had kind of exploded at that time. And it led to me moving on and experiencing things that I wish I had never had to experience in the church, but it taught me a lot. And God used those things to really springboard me into everything that I'm doing right now. And so,
is that so? Do you say that because of the specific focus on Fulton Sheen? Like, is it related to Fulton Sheen what God directed you to as a result of those negative experiences?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, when I was in Rome studying, I knew that I was meant to sort of not just perpetuate Sheen and kind of bring him back. Like he would always say, he's like, don't pray or don't try to become another Sheen. This was actually in the retreat that I was listening to. He says, but stay close to the Lord. And he says, but he was so forceful about things that he said every Catholic needed to have, not just priests. And I realized, like, this is the answer to so many different things. Mm-hmm. And for him, it was the daily holy hour. And that was something I had a great love for even before I met Sheen, thanks to my mother. She had prayer groups at our house. She was so involved in these things. I go to all the conferences that, sometimes I'm blessed to now be a speaker at one. But like this endless conferences, right? Just go along. And so anyway, Sheen was like, for me, he was the both and. It was, we need a General MacArthur for our times. And somebody who really, really knew it and could articulate it and can reach anyone. And as I discovered this man, especially when I did my doctorate on him, because I was working for the bishop for just a couple of years until about 2005, 2006. And then from 2006, when I moved on, I pursued my doctorate, and I was blessed to be able to do it on Fulton Sheen and his teaching on Mary, that I knew was everybody needed to hear. And that was my other passion, was, of course, was our Blessed Mother. So the fact that he was a servant of God at that time allowed me to write on him. So I got to know everything about this man. I mean, everything written on him. I got access to archives in Rochester. I mean, just incredible things that I had. I got to see his notes and really connect with this man. And I just knew, I said, just like he would say of St. Thomas Aquinas, that St. Thomas Aquinas was more relevant in the 20th century than he was even in his own time, because of the great need that we have of a world that is so relativistic. They need his metaphysics. And he just goes on and how he fulfilled that. Well, Sheen, people don't realize this, his whole mission was, what is the world thinking? And then how do we answer its problems using St. Thomas? Now, nobody knows that, because his TV show and all these things that he did, rarely would he ever make a reference like that, because he would take these complex truths and make them so accessible. So I just started, whenever I was giving talks, I would be using Fulton Sheen. And I was blessed at that time, because I was in Colorado Springs. Some of the places I got to test it on was like the U.S. Air Force Academy. And that's like my favorite audience, are these cadets. And like Fulton Sheen would say, he's like, there's no more sense of discipline in the world other than at Annapolis, West Point, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and somewhat on the professional sports field. And so I'd speak to these cadets, and I just would I wouldn't hold anything back, because I also knew that they were formed to be leaders. They're going to have their fingers on triggers. And I also knew, this is 20 years ago. So I kind of take a little bit of, not pride, but I'm just grateful that things that I knew back then are like, people are just discovering now. They would have said like, oh, these are all like conspiracy theories that you're talking about, using history and all that. I said, look, it's right there. And this is what we're facing. This is what the John Paul II and Sheen would talk about, like the gospel versus the anti-gospel, and who the power players are. And these cadets just ate it up, and they were kind of rocked out of their world. And they're like, I said, yeah, you're going to have to make some big decisions, but your faith has to be first. And I don't know where they are now. But anyway, so Sheen was he was always there since I first encountered him. And then when I did my doctorate on him, I finished in 2008. At that time, I was now doing parish work in Aspen, Colorado, and which was an awesome experience. Small world, but we made it big. Like we took advantage of everything that community had to offer. And culturally, people don't realize a lot of the crazy stuff that goes on in the world begins in these think tanks. Now it's like World Economic Forum. You've got Davos. Well, you also have the Aspen Institute of Ideas that was started as part of this Aspen vision. And all these same people who determine the policies of the rest of the world and other countries, it happens 3 or 4 years later, maybe a little bit after that. And so we were kind of in the belly of the beast, and we just started bringing people in, not just for speakers, but we started having events where we'd take advantage of the 10th Mountain Division. They have these huts that are up in the mountains. So you have to hike out with skis. So they call it, you skin out on the skis, and it's a half a day. So, and we take men through these intense retreats. It was really powerful. And in the midst of all this, it was, in the back of my mind is like, this is the time for Sheen to come out. How can I do this? Like, what do you want? And the Lord kind of at that point began to put on my heart some desire to be more entrepreneurial, which I never had an inkling of that, really. I mean, in the sense of I love to do things, but I was like, how would I do it? And I'm such a perfectionist that it paralyzes me to start things. Everything has to be in place. So anyway, it was, gosh, I mean, that takes me all the way like to 2015, 2016, after 9 years there. Is that when it was
born? Is that when the Fulton Institute, when did it come to life?
It came to life in 2019. When by this time we had moved from Colorado to where we are in northern Idaho right now, and who God knows how, I never thought we'd be out here. But here we are. And so, and we love it. A great community out here. But anyway, it was born in light of, I just knew I had to do it. I was just trying to survive out here for a while. I was learning roofing. I was working with a friend who took me on, and taught me that, how to do that. And that was kind of paying the bills, but in the back of my mind and in the back of my back and everything else, I'm getting injured as I'm doing all these things. I'm just like, there has to be, like, this can't be it, please. Like, what did I do along the way? But I said, you know what? It's 2019. And, it was at that time, it was the 100th anniversary of Sheen's priesthood. And I'm like, it was just very simple. And I was like, I could start an LLC, after talking to friends too, a lot of them were like, yeah, it's probably a better way to do things anyway for freedom and all that. But, at any rate, it started, and I started giving retreats on Fulton Sheen, sort of like build it and they will come. So I was more like, name it and things will begin to happen. So the Institute has been something in progress, because when you think of an institute, you're thinking lots of classes in this. And I was teaching for other institutes, theology classes, for formation, graduate level courses. And I love doing that. But I also, I knew this was to be something different, and to reach a broader audience too. So, and then COVID hit, and like all of us, I watched in a matter of 24 to 48 hours, basically 6 months plus of engagements, and my livelihood just vanish. And coincidentally, that's when I actually ran into Deacon Harold. I'd run into him before then. I think when did I run into him? It was, I think it was 2017, somewhere around then. It was a big conference, and our paths had crossed. But then right when COVID hit, I contacted him, because I was like, he's a very unique man, and he sees things differently. And it's not just by coincidence that we met, even though it wasn't much of an encounter than, hey, how's it going? Pray for each other, move on, and he's moving faster than I am, because he's got the next thing. I'm just getting back home. But it was okay. Let's keep this moving. So then I made a course, for the Institute and online. And it was sort of like a crowning of everything that I had a passion for, that I want people to understand. And it's like 30 hours of video lessons where I take people from, the signs of our times, where we are, the crisis in Christendom, and I'm using all these clips from Sheen, and then I take them all the way to like really understanding what's going on in the world, like Sheen would do, and naming the people that need to be named, as Pope Leo XIII told us to do. He said, we've got to call these people out. And by this time too, people, I knew I was vindicated from the things I was talking about, 15 years ago, the influence of Freemasonry and how that manifests itself later on, what it actually looks like today, and what the church has been saying on this for 200 years. Like, I'm not making this up. There's 13 popes, talking with condemnations, but who can lay out, what does this look like? How has it actually grown from this to where we are today? And that's where I take people throughout this course. And it's called The Final Hour, Fulton Sheen's plan to save America.
Wow. That's amazing.
And the world. I think I have an ellipsis, and the world.
Wow.
Anyway, so that was, that occupied me during the middle part of COVID in 2019.
So is this a course that you're still teaching? I mean, is it something that can still be taught or done? It's
a passive course in that I recorded it all. It's all on my website. You go to, if you go to FultonSheen.Institute, it's there. And I've given retreat forms of it. So, it's hard to condense all of that. But I managed to do it, and it's kind of morphed into, it's morphed into, what I have right now, which as every month things are getting more intense.
And we're going to talk about that in our next episode.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, we are.
Excuse me. So that it's been, I've seen everything kind of come together. And then, of course, there was the beatification that never was, and how that impacted me, and just the timing of everything. But, it's been, you go through life, and when you have a mission, and then what the state of the world is, you get impatient. And, excuse me, and it's one of those things where, Lord, if not now, when? But I know his timing is perfect. And just within the last couple of months, he's been doing a lot with me and bringing other people into my life. And there's only one or two more pieces that need to come together. But even before that actually happens, there's some exciting things that we'll talk about later. But in the midst of all that, that's kind of been my testimony of I've lost a lot along the way serving the church. I've been betrayed a couple of times in very painful ways from those that were close to me, and God turned those into things that into something better later on. But it's the times in which we live, and he's taught me a lot of his, not just taught me, but experience of his mercy. I think the virtue of trust has been most paramount in all of this, because there's hardly anything conventional about what the path that God has had me on.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been many times my wife would talk to me and say, I wish it could just be more stable. And I'm like, I know, honey. I know. I feel like that false hope person. Like, it's the next one, honey. The next one's going to be it's the winner. It's the thing. But
I don't know what those conversations are like at all.
No, wow.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us. That was really powerful. And your father, I'm assuming that he did survive and heal and had, the remainder of his life. So
yeah, he lived till 2012, which was way beyond,
That's
what he was
amazing.
supposed to. So the last little, it's not a parentheses, but it's not my conversion testimony, but it's who I am, is the extension of my wife, Chantal, and we have 6 beautiful children, and we have 1 grandchild as well. And I look at them, and I'm like, I wouldn't trade anything for these beautiful little saints. I've got 5 girls and a boy, and from 2 to 19. And I just, they have taught me more about the man I need to be, more than anyone else, because I've had a lot of challenges with in our family life, like many. We've had to overcome them with marriage and children and parenting, and I just think there's there's a message of trust and hope that I hope that when I speak with people, I try to pass on, because most people, I realized when I stand speaking to the choir, I know that choir is really wounded and perhaps ready to walk out the door on each other, and yet they're praying and they're doing these things, but it's like there's something, the diabolical war is on. So I'm so blessed to have had a patient and loving wife and wonderful children. So
That's
Amen.
beautiful.
the closing mark.
So how can people reach you and follow you and support your institute, Peter? How do they get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, you can go to fultonsheen.institute, and you can see what we're offering. The different, I have the one course up there now, various retreats and shorter events. I love live events. So there's nothing more powerful than a live event. I always recommend that with people.
Mm-hmm.
People, like Sheen would say, there's like 1 or 2 key moments in your life that you experience where the decision that you make at that moment will affect the rest of your life. Mine was never, mine was never with a recording. Well, that one, he wasn't alive, but I did take a retreat with him. But it's been when I've made that step towards something, and God honors that and takes it on. So anyway, FultonSheen.Institute. Also, you can go to FultonSheenMovement.com, And that's in relation to, I'm sure, what we'll be talking about next regarding his beatification.
Right. Exactly. And you are available to speak at missions or retreats or come and do presentations or conferences and everything, right? So people can reach out to you there and hire you for their events. Wonderful.
That's
Alrighty.
right.
Well, thank you for being here. We look forward to our next interview with you. And if you would like to get involved with Awaken Catholic and the Prodigal Life, we have a wonderful app that you can download. It's called the AWAKENapp.io. There's prayer library, music, messaging, podcasts, daily reflections, daily saint of the day. And please go to the AWAKENapp.io, and Deacon's going to tell you how you can support us.
Just go to theprodigallife.com, and on there you will see different levels of giving and sponsorship, and we've tied those giving levels to the hierarchy of angels.
Great.
So you can become an angel investor in the Prodigal Life.
Amen. All right. God bless you all. Thank you.